Hey everyone, this is the WG-KMS meeting number 18 for October 4th, 2022. I think that we don't have an explicit agenda, but it's been a while since we synced. So I think it'd be good to kind of get an update on where folks are at on various items. Any blockers or anything like that. So I guess maybe we could just go around to everyone. Anyone volunteer to go first?
Yes. Who was first? Okay. So I'm kind of ashamed to ask this, but with the pull request that I created months ago, should I close it? Should I open it against a new repository? Is it even still? How much did change in the meantime? Should I? Is it still valid? Yeah.
Yeah, so I have not looked at it, which is my fault. However, I would assume it is still valid because we haven't changed any of the API. All we're sort of desperately trying to do is get Kubernetes in a place that like we have all of our spots. So like it took like Anish a month to get like a folder effectively created for us to put the KMS stuff in, which is absurd, but that's how long it took before the staging repo was like actually created. And this was like with Anish nagging them every single week, like just adding more and more people to the list of people he's nagging like every single week with every ping, right? So that was kind of, that took a long time. And like right now, I have some PRs open that like are waiting on review from Jordan because they're changing like the wiring of the API server to like make it do more sane things that like it's like hard blocking Nilex work because we can't do the hot reload without it. It's like completely stomping all over what Rita's trying to do with the bug fix, but like it's not like it's like a big kind of dumpster fire there. So I was focusing on those because I basically don't control the approval of those. Whereas for like the reference implementation and stuff, I have more time because I just have to review it and I can just approve it and it's fine. It doesn't, I don't have to like drag in like Jordan and everybody else to review it with me. If you wanted to move it to Kubernetes, it's fine with me. Like if you wanted to just open the PR there instead, like to migrate the code into the new KMS staging repo. Because that's where it's gonna live, like where it's supposed to go. So if you wanted to do that just so it would run on CI and stuff, like if you have tests and you want them to run in CI and see it go green, that's totally fine. But you haven't done anything wrong. It's me and like maybe like a tiny bit of Anish's fault. It's primarily my fault.
Yes. No, it's not about fingerprinting, and we don't mind so much where create pull request as long as the effort is not lost or it's still useful for the KMS v2 effort.
Yeah, so we still want the reference implementation. That is, I think, pretty key for us to make sure that we don't duplicate a bunch of effort across the providers, but also that the baseline sort of quality that's expected out of such an implementation can be assumed to some degree. Like obviously, like, you know, like for example, Anish just added like a ton of validation to the responses from the KMS plugin. Like we're way stricter than we are in like V1. We're like, this is how big size you get and we'll tell you, and like all the schemas has to look exactly like this. If you don't send us some fields, we'll get mad. Which I expect the reference implementation is probably already doing, like otherwise it probably wouldn't work. So yeah, I think like I want to get at least some of it in, if not necessarily like the final version of it in 126, mostly because I want some of our tests to use like a real, like an actual implementation, not a base 64 implementation. and be able to sort of
Is it my connection or is it Mo's connection?
I think it's more like I was gonna.
I'm here.
Yeah, felt like you were frozen.
No, I was just not moving. I was pretending.
the recording still. If the recording is still working, can y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I just switched to my phone's internet. Use a different provider. What was the last thing y'all heard me say?
We want to get some bits of the reference implementation in, but not the entire one.
Yeah,
At
for
least
the
for
test you said.
Right. So what I was going with that is like, I don't feel the need for the reference implementation to be perfect and complete for pieces of it to get merged. Is sort of the bit I'm getting at. So like, for example, I don't necessarily assume it has perfect metrics or something like metrics yet. It's fine. Like I think we should get a good enough thing in so that other people can work on it with you instead of like it being all elsewhere. Like the sooner there is code available within that repo, I think the better. And I do want to be able to have it used in tests so that way, like, once we start like adding metrics and stuff to it, we could have an integration test for KMS v2 that's using the reference implementation, performing some operations, and then making real assertions saying, yeah, no, the metrics actually work because you can see them, like they're being put somewhere, and so forth and so on, right? Like I want to test the pieces together. And we probably can't do like real performance tests because it presumably won't be reaching out to a real key vault, but even that might not be out of the question if we wanted to set up like a true E2E style thing somewhere. We might be able to do something like that where we actually hook it up to a real key vault. There might be some weirdness with cloud dependencies there, or something like that. So yeah, so what are your thoughts, Christoph? What do you want to do next?
This was my second question, basically, if you need help with anything.
Let's see. Let's bring up the board so that way I'm not just guessing as to what we have written.
So what's the next step for getting Christoph's PR in? Is it just more reviews?
Yeah, so it probably makes sense for it to be moved over to a PR on Kubernetes because we do have the spot for it to live.
Yeah.
So it could be reviewed and merged into that
The new repo.
in that new repo / staging directory. So that would make it more visible if anybody else cared to take a look. It'd be easier for them to see it and so forth. So that I think is sort of the next step on that one. And then I will work on we'll improve it as time goes on. So we have about a month from now is code freeze. So we have that time to keep merging stuff into Kubernetes. And then I think like a week after that is test freeze. So we can keep writing tests for a week after that. And afterwards, we can still keep writing code. We're just not allowed to merge it into the main branch or the master branch, which I think is also just fine. Like there's no harm in making PRs and getting them ready for the 127 release cycle. But for example, one of the things we have to do to go beta in 127 is, well, write out all the requirements for beta, but one of them is the reference implementation. So like, yeah, we do want to probably have, you know, bits and pieces of it ready, so that way we're a little bit ahead of that curve. Because there's generally, like, because of Christmas and all that stuff, like there's actually surprisingly little time in between those releases, just because people are out. And there might be some desire from like Jordan or Mike to do a high level review of the reference implementation before we do the beta bump, just to check it, make sure they feel comfortable. Let's see, Christoph, did you have anything else? Okay, I was gonna, let somebody else.
No, basically that. Just curious. I looked into the board, looked through the chat, saw the message about the different repository now, and was curious what would be the right repository to target. But yeah, I will just reopen the pull request against the new repository. Maybe it draws more attention then.
Yes, that KK happens to be one that I pay attention to much more directly. So
well, I didn't want disrespect Anish repository, right? Because for me it was also very important to.
No, I was also going to say the same thing, like, because even if you review and merge there, then like you would still need to make certain changes to bring it again into staging directory. So like it's twice the work for you, like in making changes. So like, yeah, just making one change to make it land in the staging directory would be like the way to go. So I was going to say the same thing today on the call.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, and if you want to know like where you need to open the PR and all that, like let me know and I can help you out with it.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe with regards to the test, I would have some more questions, but yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, I can help you.
okay, let's see. I don't know, Rita, do you want to give an update on stuff you're working on?
Yeah. So I paired with Mo yesterday, got a better understanding of how to test things. So now I'm just going through the adding tests and fixing the bugs that's introduced by the new test. That's where things are. So hopefully today or tomorrow I'll push the PR, hopefully.
Okay, cool. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay, Anish,
Yeah. So I fixed up the expiring cache stuff. I'm just seeing what better way to unit test it. Like I have the basic unit test by removing the clock skew and I can check that it works. So I'm just seeing if I can add more tests, but other than that, I think it's complete. So I'll open a PR later today. And then once I finish that, there's one other PR that issue that I assigned to myself, the disallow multiple KMS plugins with the same name. So I will start working on that. So we add more validation for the KMS plugin names. Those are the two things in the KK repo. And then apart from that, I've been reading the two gaps that we have to look at, which are required for rotation. So one is the API server, Cube API server identity. And then the second one is the storage version API. And then I think the plan is me and Mo are planning to sync on it later today and then add it to the agenda for SIG API machinery tomorrow to see what we can do to take it from alpha to beta to GA. And I think Mo had mentioned before that one thing we can do is if there are no blockers and all that, then we could follow the same graduation. So like when we graduate KMS to beta, we can see if we can graduate the others to beta as well, like depending on how the call goes tomorrow.
Yeah, so there's the API server identity, alpha cap, and the storage version alpha cap
Alright.
that are both owned by API machinery, which basically block us from doing rotation if those things don't, or automated rotation if those don't exist, because they basically try to solve the same problems that we have to solve. So yeah, that was the gist of my idea there, is that if we can try to work on it, try to polish those things within this release, and then crisp up their beta requirements next release, while at the same time doing that for KMS, and then we can push them all forward.
So the plan is to graduate all three to beta next 127. Okay.
I mean, it should be doable, but I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it sounds like a lot of work. Just the gut check tells me it's gonna be a lot of work. But
yeah, so far I've looked at the API server identity one. Like there was no major blocker for alpha to beta. I think like tests was one thing, and then metrics around it. So tomorrow, based on what SIG API machinery says, like they're like, oh, maybe they need bigger changes and all that. I think we have to make a decision that if we can actually graduate it to beta with KMS, because there's no one working on those two right now. Like it was implemented in 120 and that's it. No one touched it after that.
Got it. Do you
Yeah.
mind linking to those in Slack?
Yeah.
And that's tomorrow, right? The meeting's tomorrow.
yeah. Oh, just as a thing, Anish, I would go ahead and, if you haven't already, add those to the agenda, because if they're not on the agenda like soon, then they'll like cancel the meeting if there's not enough items in the agenda.
Okay. Yeah.
And then there won't be a meeting for us to talk. Okay, let's see. So I think that covers you, Anish. Nilek,
Yeah. So I've been thinking with Mo on the hot reload stuff, and we discussed some edge case scenarios that we need to address. So I'm sort of working on that. Apart from that, I think Mo is also working on a PR to sort of rewire the API server, as you mentioned. So I'll probably rebase on that and see how it goes. There is one more feature that assigned to me was encrypting everything. So hopefully I will start working on that as well later today. There is one probable thing. I think Rita, you're working on the CRD encryption, right? So I'll probably will wait on that as well, but it's not a blocker for me. I can still get started on the other resource types and have like a draft PR ready just to get some like an early reviews or something. But yeah, that's two things that I've been working on.
yeah, I don't know if like Jordan will be able to get to this week, just because it's enhancements freeze week.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just planning to rebasing on your PR anyways, just sort of getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, I do really want an answer on some of these things too, because like, for example, like I added this stuff here for dynamic transformers that basically I think would make it pretty easy to add the hot reload stuff that you're working on, but also it gives you a pretty easy spot to be like, I want to encrypt everything, or some variation of everything. So yeah, I'm hoping that this gets unblocked soon, so that way the other stuff is kind of in place. So let's see. So you have this, Nish has this one. This is basically like KMS 2v2 as a whole. Rita's working on this. Nish will have a PR out tomorrow. Christoph, if you don't mind, can you make an issue in Kubernetes that's like have a reference implementation? Because like I think that's part of the issue, is because I didn't make an issue for it. It's not in this board, so I'm like, I don't know how to do anything.
I will try to do so tomorrow.
Let's see. Yeah, storage migration is basically the discussion we just had around those two API machinery caps. Oh, and let's see, Anish, I think you were gonna like help this person make this PR better or something.
Yeah, I pinged him on Slack today. So
Okay. We talked about heart reload stuff. Okay. One thing that I have not done yet, but I will soon. It's related to KMS, but you know, it's not hard blocked on anything. Is the two issues that Ram had opened. I was gonna try to distill the response from the other leads into like a answer to those issues and close them out from that last time we discussed it. But the gist I got from like David and Mike, and I guess to some degree Jordan, was that if something is possible within KMS v1, then we should try real hard to make sure it's still possible in v2. But since the thing they're asking for is not possible in v1, and because there's some significant concerns around trying to have some kind of multi-owner scenario of database backups that doesn't fully make sense, right? Like you should not be able to invalidate a database backup because your like KMS is down or something. And that's kind of the architecture they were going for. So yeah, the gist was I was going to close it out as like, no, we will not implement this. It would significantly complicate any implementation on our side. And we just don't believe it to be a good idea. And here's the reasons why we don't think it's a good idea. Let me think. But yeah, I did look at their code. When they say they support multiple KMS providers, what they mean is when you do encryption, they ask many different KMSs at the same time to do encryption. And then like they collect all the responses. So on reads, any single KMS can decode, but on writes, multiple writes have to succeed, like multiple calls out to KMSs have to succeed. So like, it's an interesting trade-off. Not necessarily the trade-off I would make, but it's an interesting one. But I mean, so yeah, that's the kind of the gist of it is I don't think that we would complicate our design. Like for example, I would see like the reference implementation just kind of explode in complexity if we wanted to be able to support that capability within it. And it really like the whole status API just kind of stops working correctly if you're saying that there is a canonical key ID per namespace instead of per cluster. Like it just doesn't have a way to represent that. So I think it would dramatically change the kind of the thing you'd have to build if you wanted to try to build it. So just, yeah, I don't think there's enough of a use case to like just warrant the additional complexity. I guess at the end of the day, if it ends up being important in the future, you could always do a KMS v3 to address it if you insist. No, I mean I'm serious, right? Like if we do a good job with v2, building a v3 should actually not be nearly as hard, right? Like part of the reason we're having to do so much work is because basically all of this is work that v1 should have done from the get-go, and we're just doing it now, right? But like things like metrics, a reference implementation, good API review, good test coverage, all that stuff should already exist. But that's basically the reason, and like, you know, good performance characteristics. Like that's why v1 didn't graduate, right? But if v2 graduates and has all those, and like if the v3 is just saying, hey, I want a more expressive API, well, then all the other stuff is still the same.
Okay, I had a question, right? So for the graduation to beta and GA, are we saying we are graduating the proto API from alpha to beta and GA finally? So like,
Yeah, so I think the proto for the gRPC API would go to beta when you
Okay.
bump it to beta. We still have to figure out exactly what that means, because the V1 beta one only has a beta API that it supports. Well, I guess we don't really have a problem going from alpha to beta, because we could just drop the alpha and immediately just go to beta. Like there doesn't have to be any migration from alpha to beta. Alpha doesn't have any support guarantees. So like we can just go to beta and it's fine. We just change everything. But we do have to have something that tells you what beta to V1 looks or V2 looks like.
Right.
Jordan was kind of like, maybe it won't matter because like we won't change any of the fields anyway. And I was like, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Because like the point of having alpha to beta to GA is that you get to change your mind at each one of the steps. Though, I mean, you could argue that if the reference implementation works well and all the things are working, we're unlikely to discover some new magical constraint that makes us actually need to change the API.
Right.
I think for the alpha to beta proto graduation, I think we should just like we should ask like for an API review, or we'll probably get one anyway from like Jordan and stuff. I think we ourselves should very carefully look again at that point at all the fields and like make sure they all make sense, make sure they all have good names, that where we can be descriptive we are, just those types of things.
Cool. Yeah, it makes sense, because I just want to make sure the proto APIs don't get left behind in alpha when KMS V2 feature flag is in beta.
Yeah, I think we're okay there. I suspect between all of us, one of us would notice that, hey, you didn't bump the thing that you're supposed to bump.
Cool.
Let's see, anything else? I think that's all I have. I think so. Like, I'm a little bit blocked on some reviews from Jordan. I didn't talk about this one. I could work on this one right now, which is like making it so the API server has a single concept of key ID for a particular KMS plugin. I could build that in now for staleness checks. And it would mostly be functionally correct. The part that would be kind of off about it is it wouldn't be like formally correct until my other PR goes in, kind of deal. Like the gist is my other PR makes it so that for every KMS plugin, we only make one gRPC connection, meaning we only ever have one understanding of the status of that plugin, right? And the key ID that's returned in status is what the plugin is saying is its current write key, effectively. And so if you don't have that single view of the world and you have like multiple connections, well, the last time you check status on each one of those connections could be different. So you have like this weird window of like uncertainty. So that's part of the reason I didn't spend much time on it yet, just because it didn't feel good to like build a thing that like technically passes all tests, but is actually semantically still wrong because of this other thing that's out of whack. I think I had one open question, and maybe I can ask y'all, is in the way I wrote my initial version of the PR, if in the process, like, so after I've read data off of disk, so either using a cached data encryption key or by fetching a new one with the help of the KMS, after I've read that data and I parse it out and I look at the key ID and I want to compare it, if during that comparison I get an error in the sense of I tried to call status and status fails. Or more specifically, the cached status response is a failed one. I wasn't exactly sure what to do. I had like two thoughts. I was like, well, maybe I would just do a live check. Like I would do another status request, but somehow indicate that you cannot use the cache, you need to update to try to get a new valid response from the plugin. That was like one thought. Or the other kind of strange approach was to just say that, no, it's stale. Like because I can't tell if it's stale, I'm just going to assume it's stale. Right. So what we would effectively be saying is, hey, if you're running a storage migration and you get to this check and I can't figure out how to answer you, I'm just going to tell you it is stale, so that way you do write data to etcd. Meaning if it was stale, like if it was actually stale, you'll end up forcing a rewrite. The negative of that is if it wasn't stale, then you end up writing to etcd when you shouldn't have and causing churn, right? Because it would, like, if anything was watching that item that you just rewrote, it's going to get a new resource version. It's going to cause like everything to, right? And so if you have like a blip in your plugin and it's going like, your storage migration is running, you're going to cause every controller that's watching any of those resources that's currently encrypted just immediately start getting a wall of watch events, because things are changing, but not really. They're just like not changing kind of deal. But I didn't really know what the correct answer for such a thing was. Like the part that concerned me with any approach that failed the write or failed to read was that, well, now you have even more dependencies on the KMS plugin. Like the cache of the data encryption key isn't doing exactly what you expect, which is buffering you from any flakiness on your plugin. Because now you're saying that, hey, even though I have a cache data encryption key, I might still fail on a read because I can't figure out what my current key ID is. So it felt like it went in the wrong direction of like the availability spectrum. So does anybody have any thoughts?
So when it's trying to read, you're saying if the status check fails, then the read would fail?
So that is a choice. So the way it's written right now is it's just reusing the same code that we use in the health checks, which has a cache, right? It caches for a certain amount. So imagine that you were trying to hit the plugin, and at that instance of doing the health checks, you cached a failing response, right? And then during that same time interval, someone is trying to do like a storage migration or just really reading and writing data to an encrypted resource. If you had a cached data encryption key, the read would just succeed because you would just, like normally it would succeed just because you were able to read it using the data encryption key, right? But now you have in that same spot, you have to check, hey, I read the data from storage, whether it was cached or not, using a cached data encryption key or not, but I have to like assert, is that data considered a stale read or a non-stale read? Because that's how storage migration understands to do the write or not, like if it was an in-place update or an in-place no-op update. And so you have to always be able to answer that question now, whereas previously you just returned false. You literally always said, no, it's perfectly fine, right? So now because you're asking this question, you have a separate, separate cache different dependency on the plugin, whereas you previously did not.
Right. Yeah, I think like I was getting confused when you said cache, but now I understand, because whenever we do a status check, we cache it in memory, what was the last state that we got. And that's what we're going to use to do the stale check. So when we do a read and then we compare the key IDs there, if they don't match, we're like, oh, it's a stale read.
Right. Yeah, so I was trying to balance like the semantic correctness of the code with storage migration requirements, while also not increasing the possibility of causing just like random errors to like, because when you get an error at this state, you just get a 500 all the way out to the client with this horrible like, I don't know what to do with this path, and the client's like, well, I sure the hell don't know what to do with that path API server. Maybe you should figure it out.
I mean, in this case, the status called failed, right? So why would you say that the data is stale? That's the thing, right? Like logically, it should only be stale if status actually told you it's what you have is stale. So when it
Right.
fails, is actually a no op, right? In that you don't actually know.
Right, but if I return false
Mhm.
up the stack, what that will do is it will cause the storage code to short circuit on certain paths and not go further.
Right.
But because I don't know if it's actually false,
Right. It's like you have to return something.
right?
It's
I
a
have
little
to.
bit like Schrödinger's cat, in that either way you have to tell us something even though you don't actually know.
Yeah, well, the difference is you can return an error. So you can say, I don't know, which will
Okay.
fail the entire request, which funnels up to like,
see.
do you want to do that? Like that's the easy and obvious answer.
Mhm.
I'm just concerned that,
The impact.
yeah, like I don't want to be on the receiving end of the customer case, which is like, hey, my cluster like randomly like once every so often does this thing and it like breaks my controllers in weird ways, and I don't like that. And I'll be like,
Is there a thing kind of like a, I don't know, like a retry type of thing where you can back off and retry based on certain, and then you return?
yeah, so retries are an option. We do have a tight window because requests usually have a 30-second timeout. So like you have like a pretty small window where you can retry, but yeah, retrying is an option. Airing out is an option. Returning true is an option.
I mean, I guess like my other question is like, what could cause the status call to fail, right? So if that is failing, maybe other parts is failing as well, right? Like meaning you can't actually talk to the plugin, or maybe the backend is down, in which case it's actually valid.
Right, but the reason we have the data encryption key cache is to paper over the plugin being down for some small window, right? So that's like the part that kind of is bad about this, right? Like you built this fancy cache in memory, which Anish is now rewriting to be an expiring cache, but whatever. It's still a fancy cache to prevent complete catastrophic failure for like tiny transient outages on the plugin side.
Yeah, but it's there for a limited time. Its purpose is to serve a limited time, right? So if you ensure that the cache is good for a limited time, it serves its purpose, no?
Well, no, right? Because this check would come after the cache has been used, and it could still fail, right? So like you could have a perfectly valid cache data encryption key that is consumed, is used to decode the data, but then because you can't tell if the data is stale, you fail the request, and it's like maybe the user didn't give a shit about your staleness check, right? They just wanted their data to work. I guess this is only in the update path, so the user is trying to update something. You just don't know if they're trying to update it as a no-op, as in it's a storage migration, or they're just trying to update it because they're trying to update it. So we don't necessarily have to come up with an answer now. I can just tag people whenever I get back to writing this piece of code and be like, hey, y'all, we talked about this. Anybody come up with something less awful than returning true yet?
But this makes me nervous though.
But it should. This whole feature should make you nervous.
Like, what could go wrong?
Right, that's why I'm bringing it up, right? Like we have to decide of the 4 options, realistic options we might have in this space, like which feels the least bad kind of deal and most likely to keep correctness.
I mean, definitely the retry thing, right? To the, and then the question is like, what happens after the number of retries failed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we would have to add retry, and we'd also have to add some capability into the status check to not use its cache, because if you retry and you're just going to keep getting the same cache response, it doesn't do anything. So there's a bit of nuance there, but yes. Yeah. The other aspect of like returning true in that code path is I think what will happen then is you will definitely get a write to etcd, which would then hit the KMS plugin. So in that sense, I think I'd also reasoned in my head like, hey, if the KMS plugin is actually not working at this instance, then the write will fail, and that's okay, because we can't make the KMS plugin work.
And you shouldn't hide that.
Um, yeah. Yeah, it's just kind of messy, right? We're increasing our dependency on the plugin in subtle ways, but we kind of have to. It's kind of sort of
That's what the plugin, yeah.
right.
It's not a regression.
No, yeah, you're right. It is indeed not a regression. I guess an alternative to all the things I've said so far is we could have an implementation that always returns the last successful key ID that it's all. So even if status is failing, whatever the last successful response was that did have a non failing value, you could return that one.
But that could be deprecated or removed, right? That's the whole point of rotation.
Right. I think what would make that okay is as we work on the other KEPs, the two API machinery ones, the ID that those APIs would expose would be that cached value. So you would be able to observe if the API server was behind from the outside. So if you were doing automatic rotation, you would know it has not caught up to what you needed to catch up to. So like, I think that would be okay.
You're saying there's other mechanism to restore.
I'm saying that we would in the process of doing those two KEPs build the mechanism for getting the last cache response anyway, but we would have to, because that's sort of what the API would entail, right? Like what was the last key ID that this API server saw? That's basically what that's the status of that resource would show among the other things it's already showing. So it might actually end up being, that might end up being the sort of the simplest thing is like cache the key ID separately from the rest of the health check response, like, as a different thing. So that one only changes when you get a successful one. And even if technically, if you've never gotten a successful one, meaning you just have empty strings stored in that variable, that will always never compare to the key ID because we just don't let the KMS plugin send an empty string as a key ID. So you can never not send that field. So I think that might end up being the simplest thing. It's just like, hey, we just compare it to the last value that we understood you to have. And if it's out of date, that's fine because whenever we build the full automatic storage migration, it has to be based off of the last understanding we had anyway. So like the mechanism for that has to wait for convergence anyway. So that might be okay. And that does not have any of the availability concerns. So like if status is flaking or something, it doesn't matter. It's always going to return a proper response. I think that's what I might do, and then we can keep talking on whatever PR I open for that.
Okay.
Anybody have anything else? We just got a few minutes. Okay, just as a reminder,
When you push that PR, can you just like be like, hey, by the way, this is the
spot. This is the
this is the
scary spot.
'cause I don't know, like sometimes it's not very obvious, like in the code where that thing is.
Well, because I've done some refactors and stuff already, that PR now should be pretty small. It shouldn't
one?
be the one with the key ID status checks. It should actually be pretty small. I've actually done most of the, and then Nish had to review it, where I was like, here's a diff that's useless. Just look at the old file and read it, and then read the new file and tell me if it still does the same thing.
Got it.
But yeah, I effectively rewrote the encryption config loading logic to like not duplicate like half of its own lines. So it's much cleaner now. I really hope I didn't break anything. I tried really hard not to break anything.
Well, the tests are still passing, right?
Tests are still passing. We should probably deploy it into like AKS and make sure like it passes like a real big boy test. Just to make sure, like, you know, the real provider and everything.
I work in a kind cluster.
I mean, yeah, you could do it in a kind cluster. I think having like a full like production version, I think would be a better test to make sure that I didn't regress something unexpected that is only like observable in like a real environment. I'd be surprised, like, because I didn't like really write new code. I just like move duplicated code and move the duplicated parts into the right spot. But it is still kind of subtle. So, okay, cool. Well, thanks everybody for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks too.
Good progress.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.